Morning, colleagues in the tips room. Morning to colleagues online. Welcome to today's development dialogue on the manufacturing subsectors, focusing on international trade trends. My name is Nowanda. I am a senior economist here at TIPS, and I will be taking you through today's program. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly say that this is going to be the last of the development dialogue series that we have been running. And for today's session, we're going to be focusing on international trade. I think, we've seen what's been happening, particularly with the tariffs that have been imposed by the US, and sort of looking at the implications going forward, especially with also the end of AGOA, or the expiration of AGOA. So today's presentations will be focusing on horticulture, food processing, as well as clothing and textiles, which again is important, especially since they are amongst the sectors that have been impacted by the tariffs and sectors also that have been beneficiaries of AGOA. So for today's presentations, we are going to have Gillian Chigumira, senior economist at TIPS, who will be presenting on horticulture, Dr. Michael Hector, who will be presenting on food processing, as well as Lucas Mtembu, who is going to be presenting on clothing and textiles. And as our discussant, we will have Dr. Niva Mekhetla when she comes back in the room. But yeah, I think we can go ahead and start in the interest of time. So everyone's going to have 13 minutes to present, and then we will take one question at the end of each presentation. And then we will do a broader Q&A at the end of the discussants' inputs. So if we do not get to your question during the Q&A at the end of each presentation, please keep note of your question or your comments. And then we'll try to address as much as possible at the end of the presentations. All right, so to get moving, Gillian, please go ahead and start us off with your presentation.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Gillian Chigumira, and I'm a senior economist at TIPS. I will be speaking today on horticulture and just looking at some of our findings in international trade. So I'll be going through the overview, some of the global trade trends, some of South Africa's trade, some of the key constraints and implications, and just the general outlook for the industry. Horticulture is quite a big sector, so it also does cover coffee and tea, spices, fruit and vegetables, and also flowers. But because of the large nature, we just concentrated for this paper on the 3 HS codes: edible fruit and nut, edible vegetables, and our processed vegetables. So the sector is actually very well developed. You also have some very big associations there. And then the big hubs that you have for deciduous fruit is your Eastern Cape and your Western Cape. In terms of employment, it employs about 200,000 people, and most of them are in the Western Cape and Limpopo. And in terms of FDI, you do have a large number of international companies, largely headquartered in Europe. And you have your Granofruit, Libster, and McCain. And most of these are quite vertically integrated. Next slide, please. So in terms of contribution to agriculture, it is quite an important sector as it covers across many, many industries. It currently has its gross value of about 140 billion, contributing about 31% to agriculture, and second largest contributor. And then you have your citrus and the deciduous fruit driving this growth. Next slide, please. In terms of global trade, the largest traded product is your edible fruit and nuts. And globally, this is accounted for about 142 billion rand, or 6% of global trade. And what we see as the largest exporters or our competitors is mainly the US, some of the American countries, and the EU. But South Africa is a very important player in the field. It is the 8th largest exporter globally. And you can see there by product, we are actually the 1st largest exporter of fruit and nut, especially on macadamia, 2nd in citrus, and 4th in deciduous fruit. Next slide, please. In terms of just our value, you can see there that our edible fruit and nuts is South Africa's 8th largest exporter to total exports. That's about 4.5%. And this has really grown over the years from about 2.7 billion to 90 billion in 2024. And then you can also see there that our imports have actually also been rising over the years, particularly for our processed prepared vegetables and fruits. Next slide, please. And then what's very important is most of our exports are actually in the fresh fruit. So you will see there that a lot of our oranges and citrus are exported fresh. And this is very important because it means we really, really need to meet our importers' requirements and meet the SPS standards. And then I'll talk about it later in some of the constraints. And also because, you know, these days they really are defining, you know, your price premiums because of just the intensive technology we add to this. And if you think of our high value claim and gold that we have in consumer preferences for fresh fruit. Next slide, please. So in terms of our top imports and exports, South Africa really does export a lot to the EU as well as the USA and some of the Middle East countries there. And most of our top exported products, I've already said, includes the citrus and your deciduous fruits. And also we import largely from the SADC region, but as well as the US and some of the EU countries. Next slide, please. And then quickly there, you will see that most of our imports and exports come from the SADC region, the EU, the Americas. And then just slight in red there, you will see when the drought came and some of the SACU bans have really been impacting our imports and exports, but I'll speak to it later. Next slide, please. So some of the very big constraints affecting our trade, you know, is the non-tariff barriers. This has really been an issue. The two biggest one is your false codling moth and the black citrus spot. Now, with the black citrus black spot, we've seen that a number of countries actually do accept the fruit without the leaves. But the EU has been very, very restrictive on this because they fail to account on some of the regional differences. And we also saw that for the first time last year, South Africa actually took the EU to the WTO. This is ongoing, and the EU has actually extended this ban. And some of our constraints, as I said, we all know with the infrastructure, but a big one really is the electricity. And just as an example, for you to ship oranges to the EU, they need to be pre-cooled below 2 degrees Celsius for 20 days. So you can imagine this the amount of power you need in cold storage, also our water issues. And then climate change, I think we've seen what's been happening with the droughts, the floods, the heat waves, and some of the diseases happening there. So even with technology in netting, it also creates an optimum condition for pests, and that's been an issue for years. Next slide, please. And so one of the biggest constraints, as Nokwanda noted, with the EU and AGOA and what's happening there, I think it's a pretty little bit melancholic. AGOA has come to an end, unfortunately, and it used to benefit 75% of all our agriculture exports. Just in terms of horticulture, we export about 6 billion. And so this came to an end. And also, unfortunately, the generalized system of preferences that gave us additional preferential accesses also came to an end in 2020. But it also does continue for the other countries except for the US. And then, unfortunately, I think a couple of months, we were also hit with the new foreign policy, the Trump tariffs, the 30% on South Africa, which would generally have a horrible impact on the Western Cape and Eastern Cape because those are the largest exporters to the US. And if you're thinking of the nuts, then that would impact Limpopo and Mpumalanga. Next slide, please. And then another big constraint we've been facing, it's just within the region. A lot of reports are actually saying there are quite a number of trade disputes between South Africa and our northern borders. So we actually export around 5.7 billion to SACU in terms of vegetables. And then we were hit by a SACU ban from Botswana and Namibia. Now, Botswana has lifted its ban in 2 phases. The last one ended in April, but the ban with Namibia still stands. And as we speak, there's also a tomato issue happening, as well as some bans of South African exports of maize and sorghum. Next slide, please. And then just in concluding, so it's all not doom and gloom. There is some hopeful outlook. A couple of days ago, the US adjusted its tariffs and there's been a partial reprieve. So the 30% will no longer apply on some of our agricultural products. And so we'll still be able to export with the preferential treatment for some of the teas, nuts, coffees, fruit juices, limes, oranges. And this really is a big relief for the farmers in Limpopo and Mpumalanga. As I said, we are a very huge largest exporter of macadamia nuts. But unfortunately, there is no relief in terms of wine and grapes. We export around 820 million rand to the US. And so unfortunately, this is one of the issues of what happens within the grapes industry. But as I said, it's not all doom and gloom. There has been a lot of expansion initiative in terms of trade. So we've seen government and private sector, they're really trying to drive more markets. And recently there's been exports to the Philippines, additional exports to Vietnam, Japan, and recently they're finalizing some more exports to China on our palm fruit. And the last slide. So again, as I said, we also have a hopeful outlook because of the counter seasonality and also just the massive R&D that has gone into some brand recognition, like such as our Clem and Gold products, but also rigorous R&D in terms of the drone technology that's controlling pests, precision farming. But as I said, the advanced cold chain, especially in the citrus, has really benefited us. If you are able to literally make your fruit last longer, the texture, the color, and the delayed ripening, that means you can have more market expansion. And then, as I said, consumer preferences also has actually grown, especially after COVID, for plant-based foods and superfoods. And so this has also been driving our exports. And just the key takeaways, as I said, South Africa really is a large global player, especially in the citrus fruit. And then our biggest barriers, as I said, is our non-tariff barriers and what's also happening with our US and foreign trade policy. But we do have a big advantage in our R&D and the market expansion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gillian, for your presentation. Right within time. Appreciate it. Any questions in the room online?
Knox, there is a question from Rendani.
Please unmute.
Thanks, Gillian, for the presentation. No problems. Yeah, quick one. Considering that, we do expect these bans to regularly occur for a number of reasons, including those outside of our control. In terms of the pie on the export lens, do we then regularly ensure that it's not overly dependent on one market, or do we just wait and see what has been the strategy or approach so far, considering that this is actually a risk that could emanate almost out of nowhere? Thank you.
Knox, we have another hand, but Joshua, if you want to ask that question.
Thanks, Rendani. Let me quickly answer you. So some of the bans, particularly in SACCO, have also been fostered by the sanitary and phytosanitary standards issue. And so we've been seeing a big drive by Department of Trade and Industry as well as Department of Agriculture in solving some of these issues. And then there's also been a drive, especially with the Citrus Growers Association and government, to expand into other markets. And I think a big issue was really understanding some of the non-tariff barriers, just some of the requirements, phytosanitary standards in Asia, what is needed there. And so there's been a big drive for market expansion, just so we don't also rely on the main markets we've also had. And also just a drive to say what's happening within climate change, what are the drivers and consumption patterns, so we can also tap into those markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. We do have 2 minutes, so we can take Joshua's question. Please unmute.
Thanks, Chair. My question is that given that we are facing challenges, particularly with the traditional market for fruits exports, so what are the markets that we can look at to diversify our exports? Did you identify prospective markets that we can diversify to? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. In the presentation and in the paper, the National Agricultural Marketing Council, largely responsible for identifying markets, has actually looked at Asia because of the large populations there. And as we speak now, and I showed in the presentation, that there actually has been efforts to drive more exports to the Philippines, to Vietnam. And as we speak now, as I said, especially with the palm fruit, your apples, as well as your prunes and pears, Hot Grow has been working with the departments to export more to China. So we've actually have seen some concerted efforts. And I think this has also been driven by what's been happening with the US foreign policy.
Where do apples fall?
And apples.
Yeah, where?
So apples are under deciduous fruits, yes, and they're also part of horticulture.
Okay.
Yes.
Sure. Pauline, I think, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we can take it at the end. So let us move on to the next presentation. Dr. Hector.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Or, yeah, it's still morning. Morning, everyone. So I'll be going through the international trends for the food processing sector in South Africa. So before we start, just there will be some overlap with some horticultural products, especially because in South Africa, agriculture and food processing is very much, it overlaps. So it was somewhat of a pain to try and figure out the value chain, because a lot of the farms are essentially vertically integrating. So they do the growing, but they also do the processing. And a lot of the things Gillian just covered, which makes my life a little bit easier. Just for some context. So first, I'm just going to go through a little bit of the background and the context, some trends in the global exports, imports, and then South Africa's food processing in overall South African trade, and then some FDI things that were noticeable during the period that I did the study. Next slide. Okay. So just for context, as I mentioned earlier, there is the sort of overlap between agri and food processing. Now, essentially, what is noticeable in the South African food processing sector is that it's very much concentrated among a few large corporations, the top 10 of those companies generating more than 80% of the industry's production revenue. Now, compared to other manufacturing sectors, we do see the sector being heavily concentrated, specifically in the Gauteng region. And the sector is also very much highly urbanized. In terms of its gross value add in 2023 accounted for about 131 million, specifically coming from meat, fish, and fruit and nuts. And the sector employs around 320,000 people, and this is based on Q2 2024 data. So in terms of the global export trends for food processing, we see top exporters being Germany, the Netherlands, the US, France, and China, which account for nearly 30% of food processing exports. Specifically, Germany and the Netherlands, two of the top or dominant exporters. And this is largely because of, in the case of Germany, the integration into the EU. Both countries, Germany and Netherlands, spend a lot of money in R&D and innovations, things like climate smart agriculture, vertical farming, very high sanitation requirements, and a lot of tech going, like robotics, for example, going into food processing. So it's very difficult to sort of compete with these countries. Now, when we compare South Africa's sort of stance in the global exports of processed foods, we see that this is relatively low, just under 1%, and if you want to be very technical, it's about 0.5%. But we sort of rounded up a little bit. In terms of the products, in terms of the export products, specifically meat, fruit and nuts, those sort of processed products. In terms of global imports, the top importers in the world, specifically the US, China, Germany, the UK, and France. Now, the US is the largest food processing importer. I think it accounted for about 132 million US dollars in 2023. In terms of South Africa's food processing imports, also relatively low, just below just below 1%, sorry. In terms of our exports, this accounts for about 8% of our total manufacturing exports, and the imports is around 5%. Now, in terms of South Africa's exports, and I think just in terms of our export markets, we see Africa being the largest export market for food processing in South Africa, specifically SADC and SACU, and other key export markets being the EU, China, and lastly, the US. Even though the percentage is small, it's still a significant amount of exports and money. The top exports, as you heard earlier with the horticulture, are mostly fruit and nut products, sugar and confectionery products, as well as preserves. Also, in terms of our imports, South Africa imports a lot of products, specifically milling and baking. This accounts for around 40% of our food processing imports, and most of it coming from the EU region, which accounts for about 33% of all of our food processing products. And then the two biggest ones being obviously the EU and China. Once again, as I mentioned, sugar confectionery, preserves, and milling and baking products. I won't go through every single product, otherwise we'll be sitting here all day. Don't think everyone wants to hear about bread and scones and those sort of things. In terms of the FDI, and this is just based on the TIPS FDI tracker between 2018 and Q4 of 2023. But what's noticeable, and there was a lot of things, and in the paper, sort of these FDI projects and so forth were tracked a little bit more extensively. I'm just giving a small snapshot of what's been happening. And what's interesting to note is we see a lot of increased investment into sustainability, into localization. We see specifically as a result of load shedding, the adoption of renewable energy, solar, and so forth. And then also climate resilient technologies. We see companies like McCain Foods investing in regenerative farming practices. As I mentioned earlier, there is that overlap and that sort of vertical integration with agriculture. And this naturally comes down to the processed food as well. Now, in conclusion, as I promised Nkwanda, I'll keep it short. I won't go into a lot of details. We see South Africa, although it is a small player in terms of food processing, at a global level, when we compare it to states like the US, like the EU, like China, regionally, there has been some growth over the past few years, specifically in the previously mentioned SADC and SACU regions. We see a lot of investment happening in South Africa in terms of climate smart agriculture and renewable energy. And then obviously what's on everyone's mind is the recent modifications of the US tariff scopes. Some preliminary research has showed there is some concern over modifications, as mentioned by my colleague earlier on horticulture. Not all agricultural products are covered within these modifications. So what we see in terms of food processing, it does provide the South African food processing sector with some sort of short-term relief. However, this will be difficult going forward, especially in trying to negotiate with the United States. And as I mentioned in the slide, we see some short-term relief of things like canned fruit juices, spices, and some beef and dairy products as well. But just to leave it on some sort of positive note, that not everything is negative. We see that food processing is an important sector in South Africa in terms of generating employment, but also our exports to the other parts of the world do still remain positive. There are some hopeful things, and it would be interesting to watch going forward. It's like the Africa Free Trade Agreement and those things, and if that will increase and South Africa is starting to look at alternative markets. To the best of my knowledge, there have been some efforts made to look at alternative markets in the food processing sector and going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. You really did do the 8 minutes you promised me. I'm kidding. All right. So questions in the room, online. I know there were questions from the previous round as well that we didn't get to, but do we have questions?
We have Rendani again online.
Hi, Rendani.
Hi. Thanks, Michael. Pick one. When we look at the major exporters globally, is there a view of how much of what they export after processing is contributed by our primary exports? Did your research look at that as well? My other question then is the decision between uh, either going food processing or just staying at the primary level. Is there a view on how we decide on that as a country? I'm not really in the space, but it's interesting when looking at the numbers. One will it will be interesting to see to appreciate what the strategy is, because we're obviously seeing the results. But I'm just wondering, are we seeing what we have strategized, or are we just seeing what we've seen? Thank you.
Michael, I've got another question for you. What would be the impact of the EU packaging and packaging waste regulations on SA fruit exports?
There we go. Sorry. Just based on the first question, it's very small. This project also didn't look at sort of re-exports, but it is something that would be interesting to look at going forward. And then could you just repeat the second question? I was busy noting down something else. But in terms of the second question, I think that things like our palm fruit, stone fruits is very much processed. In terms of the EU packaging food waste, this does sort of create a situation where with higher EU sustainability standards, for example, farm to fork standards and so forth, it does increase, especially around packaging, it does increase the sort of costs of exporting to the EU market. There are some, even though CBAM does not cover things like agricultural products, or yet, to the best of my knowledge, but increased packaging will sort of increase the cost of exports. There have been efforts to sort of become more sustainable in South African food processing, especially around packaging. We do know that a lot of the emissions and so forth do come from the agricultural sector, but in terms of food processing, there is sort of avenue for South Africa to kind of get into the EU consumer market with having higher sustainability standards. But as I mentioned before, this will come essentially at a cost. Just that second question from Rendani.
Rendani, please repeat your second question.
Thanks. My second question has to do with the decision points around going agro processing or staying on or not going agro processing. How do we currently look at it? Is there a strategy, or how is that currently being determined? Thank you.
Briefly, I'm not aware of anything at the moment. I know we are looking at additional markets, especially with the US tariffs. But as mentioned, a lot of even though that 4% is low, we obviously need to take that into account in going into the US markets. But our major exporter remains the EU. And there is a lot of value, or more value rather, in the fresh side of the agro-processing sector than the processed food sector. If that answers your question.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Michael,
have
online, I see your hand, but can we take your hand at the end of Niva's discussion? You will be the first one. Right. Also, the other questions online, we'll read them out once we're done with the discussants' inputs. So we will now move on to the final presentation, and that's going to be on clothing and textiles. Lucas?
Right. Okay. Yeah, thanks, staff. Okay, so I'll be presenting on international trends in the clothing and textile industries. So this paper was done by Retabule Mulala, and what I'll be presenting today is mainly update of the paper. So what I'll cover in this paper is the industry overview, global trade, South African trade. We'll look at US tariffs, and then we'll look at FDI, and then we'll conclude with some key takeaways. So looking at the clothing and textiles industry, the clothing and textile industries contributed to 2.7% to manufacturing GVA in South Africa, with CTFL contributing 3.1%. The industry has employed about 224,000 people in Q2 2025, with CTFL employing nearly 260,000 people. And South Africa is an importer of clothing and textiles, with the industry being, with the evolution being buyer-driven and being mainly led by retailers. And the industry is supported through the RCTFL master plan. So looking at global imports, the global imports of clothing and textiles amounted to 677 billion US dollars in 2024, with top importers including the US, the EU, Germany, as well as France and Japan, which each accounted for 5% of global imports. South Africa accounted for 0.5% of global clothing and textiles imports, with top imported products including men's or boys, trousers, nightwear, and the second highest product was women's or girls and infants' dresses, blouses, coats, suits, as well as shirts. And the third highest product was men's or boys' suits or coats. And in terms of global exports, they amounted to 754 billion in 2024, with the top importers mainly being China, the EU, as well as Germany, Italy, and India, with each of those accounting for 5% of global exports. South Africa only accounted for 0.14% of global exports. So in terms of South Africa's imports, South Africa's clothing and textile imports amounted to 72 billion in 2024, with major import sources being China, African countries, Asian countries, as well as European countries. Next slide, please. In terms of the most traded products, so for us to be on the same page, wearing apparel includes normal clothes, so workwear, formal clothing, and so on. Spun and woven textiles includes silk and wool. And then in terms of knitted and crocheted fabrics, you can think of jerseys and sweaters. And then in other textiles, you can think of blankets. So in terms of wearing apparel, the main sources were China, Eswatini, Mauritius, as well as Madagascar, Bangladesh, and India. And in terms of spun or woven and finished textiles, the main sources were China, Eswatini, the EU, as well as Switzerland. And in terms of knitted and crocheted fabrics, the main import sources were China, Madagascar, Mauritius, Bangladesh, as well as India. And then in terms of other textiles, the main sources were China, the EU, and then SAARC countries, as well as India. Next slide. In terms of exports, South Africa's clothing and textiles exports amounted to 24 billion in 2024. And the major export destinations were African countries, European countries, as well as China and the US. Next slide. In terms of exports by product, spun and woven textiles were mostly exported to Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini, the DRC, Zambia, and so on. And then wearing apparel was mostly exported to Namibia, Lesotho, as well as Eswatini. In terms of other textiles, they were mostly exported to Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, France, Zimbabwe, and so on. And in terms of knitted or crocheted fabrics, they were mostly exported to Namibia, Botswana, Eswatini, as well as Lesotho. As you can see from the highest export destination. So Namibia accounted for 1/5 of South Africa's clothing and textile exports. Next slide. Okay, so this graph, these two graphs represent South Africa's trade by product. The one on the left presents South Africa's import by product. And as you can see, clothing as well as some accessories accounted for 55% of imported clothing and textiles. And then on the right, if you look at South Africa's export by product, South Africa mostly exported wool, which accounted for 26% of clothing and textiles that were exported. And these 26%, most of it was exported to China, and it amounted to 40 million kilograms, which amounted to just about 4 billion in 2024. And yeah, that indicates a glaring opportunity for value addition of wool. South Africa is the third highest exporter of wool, following Australia as well as New Zealand, with Australia accounting for nearly 400 million 400 million kilograms of raw wool. Next slide, please. In terms of the implications of US tariffs, so factories relocated in South Africa to neighboring countries in the early 2000s to take opportunities through AGOA. And the LDCs were allowed to source textiles from any country to produce clothing. And the AGOA's rules of origin required clothing to be made from US fabric, yarn, or thread or source in AGOA sub-Saharan African countries. So these LDCs, such as Lesotho and Eswatini, were exempted from this rule of origin. So it restricted South Africa's clothing and textiles exports to the US, as you can see on the graph on the left. So towards the early 2000s, South Africa was able to export clothing and textiles to the US through the MFA. And then the huge decline was because the MFA was expiring during that time, and then South Africa wasn't able to export clothing to the US because of AGOA. So clothing and textiles in 2024 accounted for 0.07% of clothing and textiles. So South Africa mostly exported manufacturing product. That was mainly autos, which accounted, so manufacturing accounted for 95% of products that were exported to the US, and the agricultural sector accounted for 5%. So the loss of AGOA will therefore have a minimal impact on the clothing and textile industries in South Africa. Next slide. In terms of FDI, so there have been minimal FDI projects in South Africa over the last decade, with PF Nonwovens investing in a new factory in Atlantis in the Western Cape. CMT also invested in a factory in KZN, which is in Ezakeni in Mbit. Next slide, please. So, yeah, in conclusion, some of the key takeaways are that the US and Europe are the largest importers of clothing and textiles, with China remaining the world's clothing factory. South Africa is a small player globally, with South Africa's clothing and textiles mostly imported from Asia, and that is mainly China. Clothing and textiles are mostly exported to African countries, with Namibia accounting for 20% of South Africa's exports. So, as I've mentioned, the loss of AGOA will not have a significant impact on South Africa's clothing and textile industries. And yeah, there's been a minimal foreign investment into South Africa's clothing and textile industries. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucas. I think this presentation in particular for me points out sort of the implications of, you know, what happens when South African companies sort of chase lower tariffs and move to other countries. So you see with the clothing and textiles and the movement to Lesotho, and how that sort of then made that country dependent on the clothing and textiles and access to the US. And so I think that presentation in particular for me just brings that out more clearly. So we will take questions online in the room if there are any. Gia?
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I actually have a question for Lucas as well as for Michael and Jill. So I don't know if I should only ask for Lucas and then for Jill, and Michael will ask after Neva's discussion. So
Yeah, start with Lucas.
all right. Okay, so thank you for the presentation. So my curiosity comes from South Africa being a net importer in the clothing and textile industries. So are there any, do you know if there are any major initiatives or any initiatives in South Africa to produce our own clothing and textile more and not rely on imports as much? And If not, maybe do you know why not? Or yeah, around that. Thank you.
Okay, Lucas, I have another question for you. What kind of textiles are exported to China?
Okay, thank you for your questions. In terms of the last question, so the textiles which are exported to China are wool, as I've indicated. And then in terms of South Africa being a net importer, there are initiatives to produce clothing and textiles within the country, but there are multiple limitations. So if you take Shein, for instance, so there was that de minimis rule which was initiated, which was removed actually by SARS, and then now parcels which are less than 500 charge VAT as well as the 45% rate. So in terms of policy, there's that, but also in terms of the legality of Shein. Shein actually is supposed to have a legal representative within the country, which it doesn't have. So there are limitations also in terms of the retailer being compliant within the country. And then in terms of production as a whole, South Africa cannot focus on exporting finished clothing into other countries, mainly because it's a new entrant into the global market and it cannot compete with China because of pricing. Yeah, I think I covered your question.
Okay, I think we'll take Nicole's question at the end of Neva's input, just because I think I'd like to give the other presenters an opportunity to respond to it as well. Neva?
Hey. So, yeah, I want to thank everybody for their presentations. I think, the aim of this project is to have in-depth studies of industries in one place. This is only, as you know, part of a series. And the idea is that firstly, for people who just are in the industry, want to get the information easily, but also reference for other researchers or for policymakers. But it's also to develop our expertise at TIPS. I would urge anybody who's working in this area who would like to have a conversation with people. These are our people that are becoming experts in these areas. And there are also other industries online. I think, Nakwanda, you can mention which ones are there. Having said that, I'm going to talk more generally about our trade systems because I think these can also be seen as case studies of how our trade issues are working. And I think what it really demonstrates is how hard it is for us to get exports going outside of mining and the mining value chain. So South Africa is very unusual in the sense that more than half of our exports come out of the mining value chain. For other upper middle income countries, even if we exclude China, the figure is like 30%, and that includes the petrostates. And the only really big manufactured export we have is auto. And obviously that's also very much affected by the Trump tariffs. And so I think what it shows is, 30 years later, since 94, we've had a policy of saying we want to diversify into manufactured exports as a way of driving industrialization, and we really haven't done it very well outside of auto. And I think, as you could see from Lucas's paper and also the paper on food processing, that we're very far behind, particularly on light industry. So if you compare the share of our exports from clothing, electronics, other sort of light consumer goods outside of food, horticulture, not processed foods, it's a much smaller share in South Africa than for other upper middle income countries. And that's a problem because what it means is that when we grow our exports, we're not actually growing employment. The mining industry doesn't create a lot of jobs. I mean, the mining value chain doesn't, particularly beneficiation, but even the mines themselves, they create 400,000 jobs, but it doesn't grow very much when output goes up. And so if those are the core aims of export, if that's the way you maintain a political base for supporting export-oriented industrialization, we're not able to maintain that base. And that's one of the reasons we can't get the resourcing we need for a serious industrial policy. And I also think I think we need much more work on why we have been unable to achieve a sort of qualitative shift in our export structure. But I also think that what we've learned over the last 30 years is it really doesn't help to keep raising tariffs. All it does is particularly when it comes to necessities. It raises the cost of living for poor people. And I think what you can see if we look at horticulture and food processing as some of the challenges we face, it's like, it's great that horticulture is grown, but it's still a commodity, so we're getting away from dependence on mining, but we're still dependent on a commodity, which means it's very much subject to the vagaries of world markets, and also to, if the prices go up, other people start to produce it. And we did used to be the world's largest citrus exporter. So I think that this is one of the arguments for moving into manufacturing, is that it's harder for other people to compete with you, but we have, where we've really grown largely has been horticulture. And obviously we have this issue with Trump, which I think we need to spend more time talking about. Like, they have backed off on some of that, but not for deciduous fruit or wine. It's only 5% of our food exports, of our horticulture exports, go to the US. So it's really not as bad for them as it is for, say, aluminium or cars. But I think it's still, the fact that we're so much at the mercy of their whims is a problem. I think another problem which we haven't discussed is, of course, who benefits from those exports is mostly commercial farmers. And that is not, I don't think, a policy issue in the industry, because the fact is we inherited an economy where family farms had essentially been wiped out. But it does mean that, in contrast to other countries, you're not having the same sort of support for small business and so on that you would have in other African countries, where obviously everybody's thinking about Kenya at this point, where they've managed to grow horticultural exports. And I think that points to the really difficulty of thinking about, so it creates employment, but it's not good employment, and it doesn't create small business. And so you're not really dealing with the distributional issues when horticulture grows, although obviously it helps in other ways. And the one thing I want to flag, because somebody kind of said that there is a problem with saying we should beneficiate food exports, because the fact is, as I think Jill was pointing out, most people no longer want to eat processed foods in the same way. So people don't want tinned foods, or, some frozen to some extent. But even our fruit juices, which are all over the world, they haven't grown as fast as fresh fruit and veg in exports. And I think that is an issue of consumer demand. So in contrast to mining, where you have this very long, extensive downstream value chain, in the food value chain, we don't have that in the same way. But I also think one of the trade-offs that comes up there that we need to talk about more is this issue about food security. That, if you're pushing commercial farmers to produce export goods, does that lead to higher costs for other things? And what we've really seen is more on the import side, that, we've seen very high tariffs on poultry and to some extent on wheat, and those are staple foods. And we never really talk about what are the trade-offs of saying we want to improve our balance of payments in particular products where they are staple goods. The same thing applies with medicine. How much should we pay to have a local medicine industry when that's clearly a necessity? Does it make sense to say we'll pay twice as much so we can produce it locally? How do we think about that? And then finally, what this data also shows is, for these light industries, the importance of exports to Africa, and particularly Southern Africa, for our manufactured products. That, our mining products all go, well, mostly to China, but also everywhere in the world. And our horticulture products mostly go to Europe. But these light industrial, where we have light industrial goods, they're actually going to the region, and very disproportionately to Namibia and Botswana, which are tiny, but relatively high income. And I think what it points to is the need that, if we're serious about growing our export base in the region, which every other major exporter has, we need to be much more serious about saying, how do we shift the division of labor in the region so that we have more industrialization across the region, rather than seeing it as we will just export even though they remain poor, and that just doesn't work. We need some way of saying, what can we import from them, as well as what can we export to them? But I would also argue that it also points to the importance of upgrading our marketing support. That, the only export industry we have that has really, really good marketing from the state is tourism, and it actually worked. But when you look at our marketing, our export strategy generally is probably relatively weak for all of manufacturing. And maybe it's because with mining we never had to, it sells itself. But anyways, I think if we're serious about it, we need to say, and I remember with the Chinese one saying, back in the day, Rob Davis was saying to them, We want to export more manufacturers. And they said, oh, you can come to our trade fairs. And we all thought they were kidding us. But of course, that's what they do. And I don't think we took that story seriously enough. And then finally, of course, the thing about trying to diversify away from mining is that, and even commercial horticulture is, we're trying to fix the car while we're driving it. We can't afford to reduce our exports of those goods. We need to find a way to grow other exports as well. And that's really hard to do. To sustain existing production while growing new kinds of production turns out to be really difficult. So thank you.
Thank you, Niva. So we have reached the end of our presentation session. I would send you all home, but we still have a Q&A. So I have some questions that have been posed online. Michael, I'm not sure if your hand is raised on the coffee question. So I will let you speak, and then we'll go to Nicole Monsami and then Itumeleng Mokwena. You can then unmute and ask your question. So Michael, let's start with you and then move to Nicole and then Itumeleng.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's always a pleasure to hear Tip's work, and I appreciate the thoroughness of what you do. I've got actually two questions. The one is, our trade data, does it show what we re-export as opposed to what we manufacture and add value to and then export? Because I think there's an inherent distortion in the trade data. That's the first observation. And the second is really a fundamental question. It strikes me that we have a place called Coffee Bay, and we have vast land along the eastern seaboard, all the valleys that can be could be terraced, etc., could be cleared, and we should be one of the leading coffee producers in Africa, but we're not. Why is that? What is the problem? Is it because of land tenure arrangements, or is it reluctance of big business to go into a very important market? And as a counterexample, I mentioned blueberries. 15 years ago, I don't think we produced any blueberries whatsoever. And that is a crop that is totally dependent, ironically, or it was dependent on United States inputs for the entire technology, from the little seedlings all the way through to the drip feed irrigation systems. What can we learn from that? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Michael. Nicole?
Good afternoon. I think it's just gone afternoon. I think my question just centers around the impact of the shift in the tariffs to our neighboring countries. So I think this is specifically evident in the presentation on the textile side, where we actually saw that South Africa lost a lot of its manufacturing capacity to our neighboring countries. So if those neighboring countries, it might not necessarily only just be on the clothing and textile side, do lose their manufacturing markets, does this open the window for dumping into SA? Have we considered the impact of this, or is it what other mechanisms or policy levers are in place to avoid the South African market being further depleted by our neighboring countries looking for alternate markets? Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. Itu?
Thanks, Nox, and thanks to all the presenters for the presentation. I've got two basic questions. The first one is to all the presenters. I was just wondering, in terms of policy efforts, what are some of the policy efforts that have been made to promote exports in these sectors? And if there are any, how effective have they been? And then I was particularly curious when it came to Lucas's presentation. So in terms of the current trade war that's happening between the US and China, have you not seen any notable surge in imports from China as a result in terms of clothing and textile? Thank you.
Thanks, Itu. All right, so before I let the presenters respond, two questions that I'm going to respond to. So one is from Chandru on whether we have considered CBAM, and then the other one is going to be on the trade data. So on the trade data, we use Trade Map, which uses SARS data. So there's no differences between the data that's shared on Trade Map, first of all, and the data that's shared on SARS, on the SARS website. It's the same data. But to answer your question, yes, we are able to check whether there are re-exports and re-imports. We are able to see that data. We do at some points when we do our research indicate, how much is re-imports, how much is for re-export. And then on the issue of CBAM, so we would have covered CBAM in our first series of the development dialogue when we were talking about sustainability issues. So you will, if you check the different industry studies, you'll see that there is one report for the different industries that covers sustainability issues, and that's where we would have addressed the issue of CBAM. So I will then allow the presenters to answer the questions. I think let's start with Jill and move to my right.
Thank you, Nokwanda. I'm just responding to some of the questions. So I'm a tea person, not necessarily coffee. And I would assume that commercial drivers really are driven by profit and demand. And so it would be also interesting to actually do more research on what's happening in coffee and some of the land issues there and why it's not being utilized for that. And just responding to Itumeleng on the policy, especially those orientated around exports, there's been a lot of effort between DTIC, HotGrow, the Citrus Growers Association, and the National Agricultural Marketing Council. There's been like rigorous efforts, especially with certification. Because we export a lot of fresh fruit, you have to meet a lot of SPS standards and a lot of biosecurity standards. And so recently there's also been liaising with the consulates and diplomatic missions and some of the countries across just to find out what are the new SPS standards, how can we meet them? And it's a process. I think in one of the papers I read, it can take 6 months to a year, just the back and forth, but there has been some rigorous efforts in that demand. And just answering on the issues of blueberries, I think because of the exactly high price, if you go into even your Woolies, your Checkers, your Pick n Pay, they're quite expensive. So I would assume maybe it is a demand and supply issue. But it would be very interesting to go in depth why we are not investing more into blueberries, because you do see a lot of blueberries from Zimbabwe as well as your palm fruit there. So I would assume it's an issue of supply and demand and where the farmers know what the markets are, and maybe they start concentrating on your citrus and mainly on your deciduous fruits as opposed to maybe the blueberries. Thanks.
Michael?
Yeah, so on the packaging one, I just want to sort of circle back to that initial question on the packaging. After looking at my own work, I seem to have forgotten the sustainability paper I did a while ago. But single-use plastic is still widely used in food processing in South Africa. And this is basically because of sanitation, protection of the food products, especially when you're exporting them. There have been, from what we've noticed in my research, what I've seen is that fiber-based packaging is becoming very popular. But in terms of our exports, this will require a lot more material being used. And obviously this comes at a cost than the current plastic that's used. And in terms of the policy efforts, what we notice in food processing, a lot of it is related to sustainability, obviously because EU's our biggest market. But as I mentioned, or as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the policy efforts are done at the agricultural phase or the input phase in terms of this, specifically because obviously there's more value in exporting the fresh products than what there is on the processed foods, and then also the consumer demand, especially in the EU. So things like ultra processed food are starting to become not as popular So yeah, not sure if there was anything else, if I covered all the general points. Yep.
Have we tried asking Takealot to share their packaging?
No, I haven't. But I'm fully aware of the, you order one small thing and then you get it in this massive box. But yeah, packaging in terms of our food processing, packaging is the biggest sustainability concern. And how we go about that is going to be interesting going forward, especially with rising standards in our key export market.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of Nicole's question on dumping into SA, there are always opportunities for clothing textiles to be dumped into SA, but ITEC has been effective in countering dumping. So if that happens, a company which produces textiles and exports them would file an application to ITEC, and they would be able to investigate it and counter dumping if that happens. And then in terms of Itumilan's question on searches in terms of the US and China. So what I can say in terms of that is that China's imports of clothing textiles have actually been declining over the recent decades. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Lucas. Do you want to come in now, or?
I mean, I just wanted to say, I actually think we need a change in our mind frame, that we have become really used to saying every time an industry is destabilized, the issue is dumping, as opposed to saying the issue is that we need to find ways to be competitive. Because, sometimes there is dumping, obviously.
Yeah.
And we would expect a lot of dumping from China currently, both because of their own domestic problems and because. But I also think that, for instance, when we start saying, this is what I mean, if we start saying that if our neighbors export to us, that somehow they're engaging in unfair trade practices, what we're really saying is they can never industrialize. And I think we have to take on board the fact that, other countries in the BRICS, which are sort of regional subcenters, their GDP per person is like 1.5 to 2 times that of their neighbors, which means their neighbors are really good markets for them. And they can get up to scale if they need to. Whereas with us, we're like 4 to 5 times the GDP per capita of our neighbors. And that means they're very weak markets for us. And if we don't say, we will have to make some, if the division of labor changes in the region so that they can industrialize, there will be a cost to us, to some industries, but the overall benefits in terms of growth will be much greater. And I think, honestly, we need to start saying, if we can't compete, let's talk about why can't we compete, instead of always saying, well, they must be subsidized or they must be dumping or something like that.
Yeah.
And say, how can we address those cost factors? And the one thing I'd say about clothing is, that I just checked, and there's been an issue about steel from China in the recent past, but not about, I don't think about clothing.
Yeah. Thanks, Neva. Kia, I know you had some questions. Do you want to ask those? And then we'll take the hand at the back. If there are questions online, please, colleagues, remember to raise your hands, or you can post them in the chat. Kia?
Okay, so what I wanted to ask actually did come up in the discussion. So it was around SMMEs in Michael and Gillian's presentation. It was sort of like bundled up into both of them because their presentations were cross-cutting with each other. So Michael did mention that there is employment opportunities in food processing. So my curiosity came in from that sense to say, are there opportunities for SMMEs, especially taking into account the tariffs? Then maybe they might not have an upper hand in that respect. However, locally, are there opportunities for SMMEs in both the presentations? Yeah.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is to also add some few inputs that I have. I do agree with Michael that food processing is important in South Africa's agro industry. And with that in mind, I want to ask in which provinces do we have the predominance of this food processing industries? And that being the case, what measures can South Africa implement to expand agro industries in other provinces that are currently underrepresented? Thank you.
Sudama, do you want to Ask your question.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. I was struggling to unmute myself here.
We can hear.
Okay. So just my question, I was just thinking because there's coming at the back of the CBAM story being the, one of the imminent global or sustainable policies that are being introduced, especially in the manufacturing space. So I was wondering, so because there's horticulture, agro processing, and textile, and I know that I think sustainability policies are also coming up in some of those sectors. So I was wondering if whether the introduction or the thinking of some of those sustainability policies is already trying to change the trade dynamics in those sectors. Maybe this is a question for all the presenters, and for example, if we should be aware of other sustainable policies. For example, as we know that now we are aware of CBAM, so are there other ones pertaining to the sectors? If whether we should be aware of them or not from a sustainability perspective.
All right, thanks, Yutame. So let's take some answers. Michael, holder of the mic, do you want to stand?
Why did I decide to hold the mic? So I was just looking at the data. I don't have the specific numbers, and my phone is quite small. So I'm just going to start with the last question, as it's the one on top of my head, and I'll get to the SMME one because that's a very interesting discussion to be had, and it's something I would like to look into going further. But in terms of where it's concentrated, so when we look at food processing in South Africa, a lot of this is sort of a effect of our apartheid legacy, and a lot of the food processors were concentrated in urbanized areas. So when we look at things like GVA and employment, a lot of this is concentrated in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape. And I'm sure it's most probably similar when we look at sort of horticulture and agricultural goods as well. In terms of what needs to be done going forward, I don't sort of want to start making assumptions because I don't know necessarily what we could do to sort of change that. Because when we start looking at things, and this probably sort of ties in with the SMME discussion as well, even though there are a good number of SMMEs in the sector, there are still concerns around, let's look at the level of protection, for example, sanitary requirements. So, for example, many of the SMMEs cannot keep up with these standards required that commercial farms, they have the money to do these things. So there's a lot of things we need to sort of get over in order to kind of boost, if you will, food processing. But based purely on the data, a lot of it is still concentrated in those provinces, and I don't think it will change anytime soon because these are established businesses. As I mentioned earlier, top 10 commercial industries within food processing or companies account for 80% of the sort of revenue for the sector. And that's not going to change in the near future. We'd want it to, but a lot of support needs to be developed for those SMMEs to sort of provide those same kind of standards that these big processors are able to provide. Yeah, I'm thinking if that also answers your question on the SMMEs as well. Not sure if Niva wants to add anything else on the agri or even Gillian.
I will sit. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add one thing, which is if we see food processing as a craft thing, then there's more scope. So the thing about South Africa is because what they did under apartheid is that they basically very consciously centralized food processing. Normally is more decentralized and more in small rural towns, but under apartheid, they consciously centralized it in urban areas as a way to support the marketing boards, as part of that whole system of centralized support for commercial farms. And like Michael says, it's very hard to unwind that. But I do think if we were serious about supporting small food processing and small business in general, that catering and food processing both are things you can do as a craft thing, one of the other issues I just want to flag, food is the only thing where the top 10% doesn't consume over half of all consumer goods, but they do consume 30% of all consumer goods. And it's a problem because firstly, it gives you a bias towards imports, but it does give you also a bias towards high level craft stuff. So there is scope for that in terms of demand. And then the other thing would be to say, how do we subsidize, you know, food production for the low income group that is local and also horticultural supplies, like by having markets and things like that a bit more. And those are all systemic changes that these things exist in other countries that don't exist here because of the way apartheid really suppressed small business. And I think we need to say, what are those kinds of innovative structural systemic changes we can make if we're serious about supporting small business? And it wouldn't, and the one thing I will say, it won't be for export.
Yeah.
With a few exceptions. Yeah?
Lucas, did you? All right, Jill?
Thank you. So just responding to your questions on SMEs, I'll give you a very example with Woolworths. So they were saying that maybe the small scale farmers could support the supply, to the fresh produces market. And then Woolies was asked by the Competition Commission why they don't actually buy from the producers market. It's because they have strict specifications and contracts with farmers who, for example, practice regenerative agriculture. And I'll give an example. So for example, Woolies will say your onion shouldn't have 2 bulbs. It must be 1 bulb. And so some of these standards required by SMEs just to export out of the country is very rigorous. I think yesterday I was reading an article that said it's not easy to say to a citrus farmer, while the US has stopped imports, take them to Zimbabwe. Each country has its own standards and its own specifications, and that has become an issue. And as I said, the SPS standards also take time. Remember, if you're exporting, let's say, to the EU, it may not be to Gillian's home. It might be to Tesco. This is large retail. And so large retail will say, for example, the notches, the orange must be 2 centimeters. The banana must be exactly 10 centimeters. It must be exactly, medium yellow, not too yellow, not too bright. And we might laugh at these things, but these are very strict standards that retail has imposed that also drives out some of your SMEs into entering those markets. And then lastly, just responding to Sutame, Tesco actually had put requirements if you're exporting to Tesco. So they've graded, I think, in 3 ways to say that this is the first way you must meet our packaging requirements for sustainability. If you can't, while you're working towards meeting it, this is the second step until you get to the actual requirement. So yes, and you can imagine if you're an SME just trying to willy-nilly adjust overnight or within 3 months to some of the new standards that are being required. And I think that's where also government needs to step in to say it's very difficult just overnight. And I think I want to give you a good example. It might be silly, the automated pack houses. Those automated pack houses might be set to export to China. So you can't easily just change it because it's already packed. For example, if it's a cotton that must have 20 fruits, 4 by 5 rows, and it's packed 1 million cottons already. And so willy-nilly just to change to export to another country may be difficult. And I think those are some of the things that we need to support SMEs with. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll speak on sustainability to answer Sultana's questions. So in terms of clothing and textiles waste, we actually, across the country, we don't know how much textile waste is in our landfill. So for instance, there was a study which was done in 2018 and 2023, which looked at waste landfills across 6 municipalities in the Western Cape. So it found out that textiles accounted for 6.4% of the waste in that landfill. And that's within 6 municipalities. And we actually don't know how much waste is within other, say, municipalities and provinces. So there's the question of evaluation there in terms of sustainability that we need to be looking at. But as I indicated, that the clothing and textiles value chain is retail driven. So what happens is that the sustainability strategies are mainly led by retailers. So for instance, Woolworths has the program where they're able to buy back jeans. And then TFG also reuses packaging within its warehouses, as well as Mr. Price and others. Thanks.
Yeah, just on the sustainability thing. Sorry, I forgot to answer Sitami's question. There has been some movement, especially around, as I mentioned, as we sort of said earlier, around packaging in food processing. EPR measures, for example, it's kind of changing the way in which food processors are now doing their packaging, and there's things like a heightened focus on reducing the emissions, for example, in agricultural inputs. So we do see things like climate smart agriculture, but a lot of the sustainability questions with food processing can be solved either at the packaging level and then also the waste level, which is another issue within food processing. But mostly at the input level, we see a lot of changes happening in terms of how farms, as I mentioned, when it comes to food processing, a lot of this is vertically integrated. So changes within the input level kind of changes the way in which food processors then respond in terms of sustainability.
Thanks, Michael. Do you want to ask your questions, and then we will go to Gwen Forster?
Yeah, thanks, Knox. So, I mean, this is to Jill and maybe Niva. Jill, I think it was in 2013, 2023, 2024, we saw recent bans of horticulture products from Namibia and Botswana. And I was wondering, maybe I've missed this, I missed it in your presentation, whether you've kind of sort of quantified what were the impacts in that regard. But also, I haven't followed the situation more recently. How was the situation resolved? A lot of the analysis that came out at the time indicated that those import bans were kind of in contravention with the SAGWA agreement, and therefore these countries were non-compliant to the SAGWA agreement. But more so, when you look out more broadly, as we are turning into the region for export and promoting our exports, there seems to be inherently a conflict between promotion of national industrial policies and deeper regional integration. And I was wondering, and maybe to Niva, how can this problem be solved? Thanks.
Jill, let's take the other questions. Gwen, do you want to go ahead? Can we check if Gwen Forster's unmuted?
She is unmuted.
Thank you very much indeed. I wasn't just now. Yes, I'd like to skip past the talk shops, because I believe we have everything we need to make a change now. If we have a look at smallholder farmers, if we have a look at community gardens, if we have a look at all of that, market access is the key thing. And we've spoken about standards and this and that and the next. A critical aspect is that data recording has gone down literally to ground level on the back of climate change in particular. If we were looking at food safety, it tends to be the first point of commercial input, if you like. So it might be the pack house or whatever the case might be with fruit. But right now, the carbon economy, and there was a question about Keban, the carbon economy is an opportunity, but the key thing is that over, I'm not sure what the number is, certainly over 80% of smallholders have failed because of a lack of market access. So I want to introduce two concepts. We can take it offline. Very much sort of part of the final passion climb, if you like. But the one is that sustainability must be commercial sustainability and must be independent communities, independent farms, whatever that might be. I've referred to the ProDev CARA era, ProDev professional development, CARA community agri-hubs for rural areas. That was accepted as a national program. And it comes down to saying, why didn't it work? And I've lived all of this for a long time. To put my background simply into context, there was a time when I was responsible for the fruit industry information strategy, and a lot of that focus was export. The emerging farmers, as we call them, came into it after deregulation. We just go round and round in circles. I would love to pick up, I would love to look ahead. I will study the papers, but it comes down to saying who is accountable for making it work, who is accountable for traceability, and how do we integrate environmental factors, agricultural factors, and in particular the information systems, because if we do not come to terms with artificial intelligence, we are going to be out of the mix. So that's where I am. Thanks.
Thank you, Gwen and Itumeleng. I'll leave Gwen's question to Neva, but I think the sustainability report for horticulture will come out, and there is the one on technology. We obviously didn't go drill down to the household level, but that is an area we could look at. Just going back to Itumeleng, yes, there was a slide on the SACU bans and what's happening there. And I think it's a very complex issue because you're dealing with the Africa Free Trade Agreement, you're dealing with SACU agreement, you're dealing with the SADC industrialization roadmap, but you're also dealing with issues of food security. And so what we saw was Botswana and Namibia put up these bans to protect their local farmers and industry. And so it's a complex issue where you do have trade agreements, and then a country also wants to enhance its industrial policy. What deserves more weight there? But what's interesting in that after these bans came to protect the industry, that's when we had the 2024, the droughts and the massive heat waves. And I think I did show a slide that affected the imports to South Africa. And so immediately Botswana withdrew its trade bans because the food security issues, they did need some of this food. And so these bans were largely towards products like tomatoes, beetroots, carrots, but some of them really are big staples there. And I think so we're dealing with the SADC issue just on countries really trying to grow their economy, but also just in cognizance of all the trade agreements we've signed and agreed to. So as I said, Namibia still stands with its ban at the moment. And then there's now the new tomato issue. I'm actually allergic to tomatoes, but like the new tomato war that's happening with the export permits. But I do want to say that sometimes it's not actually related to trade agreements, industrial policy. Sometimes it is a food and health safety measure. So I know there were some issues, and these are very common and very valid. So the SPS issues do come here and there, and sometimes they're able to solve it there and then. Because I think with the issues of tomatoes, it was really actually going to affect some of the farmers heavily. And I think it's just a complex issue there. I'm not too sure how we resolve it because it just runs across many, many trade agreements as opposed, to national development. Thanks.
Yeah, so look, the thing I would say is that firstly, in terms of older story, yes, there do need to be routes to market, and people have been saying that forever. I do think that we tend to focus too much on formal retail and not enough on other things that are more accessible, but also on the importance, when you talk about communal food gardens, of local food security and how we can contribute to that, and not just to obviously household incomes, but also exports. That there are parts of the country where having more food would be a good thing. And I mean, there was a very funny paper somebody did once where they were complaining about how, these people had a scheme to supply Pick and Pay, and they could never somehow then all things that had to come together for them to meet Pick and Pay standards never came together. So, they ended up selling it locally, and that was terrible. And it's like, I don't know, it means you have more food locally in some place in impoverished parts of the Eastern Cape. And this is not always a bad thing. Mm. So I think we need to think about those trade-offs. But I also think we shouldn't kid ourselves. There are many, many much bigger problems to smallholder farming in South Africa, as well as marketing. Not bigger, but the same as marketing. Because honestly, when you destroy small family businesses, and this applies to urban as well as rural, what you end up with is there's no ecosystem for them. And I think we need to think about this in a holistic way. Like, what is the ecosystem they would need to grow? And that does mean things like inputs, and that includes land and water, which is, of course, the most obvious thing, and skills, and access to markets as well, and extension services, all of those things. And that they kind of, often you find you need a more holistic approach. You can't just do one or the other. So if you just give people land and no other kinds of support, you have a problem. If you only give them other kinds of support, but there's no access to land, also a problem, you know? And so I think, you know, it's true. We have not done agrarian reform, and this is just part of it. No? In terms of SACU, look, I think that this is the kind of conflict that arises when you have a free market between very unequal neighbors. And in terms of income, we're not so unequal compared to Botswana and Namibia, but in terms of industrialization and farming, we are. And I think that if we don't have strategies to say, how do we ensure these processes are mutually beneficial, not just through the fiscal transfer, but through the fact that the division of labor has to change over time. And you can't do it overnight, but over time, then you'll get this kind of, to be honest, in the case of Botswana, very populist measure, where we're just promising that we will protect our people. You know, like you say, in the case of Namibia, it tends to be more nuanced, but they are also quite protectionist. But I do think that we can't sit there. I mean, this actually happened where we're saying, oh, they're dumping chicken on us, so we'll put up barriers to chicken. And then when Namibia puts on barriers to us, we say, oh, those are unfair trade barriers. You know, you either say we're going to focus on increasing competitiveness and cutting costs in order to compete, or you say we'll all have trade barriers. But what we can't do is act like how shocking they put trade barriers on us, when from their point of view, they can never industrialize, or in this case, develop commercial farming, if they're competing with very well-established and advanced commercial farmers in South Africa, where we've invested in them for, you know, centuries.
Thanks, Neva. Please hold on to that. Let me just check if we have any more questions. Can I see if there's hands online, please?
No hands?
All right. All right. Neva, do you want to start us off with your closing remarks, and then we'll go the other way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually don't have anything. I've said everything I want to say, but I want to say thank you for the very interesting questions, and also for the inputs, which I think were, you know, are really useful. And it's really, to me, I hope people use these things as what they're supposed to, which is really like we have a library of reference on many, on, you know, most of manufacturing at this point, where there's this kind of in-depth study. And I think that should be useful for time.
Closing remarks. Lucas, close.
Thank you. I think my closing remarks, especially with SACU, because it has come up a lot. So I'm going to give it to Diako and Danae. There is the regional tracker that's out there. And I think it also tracks some of these issues better. So I do encourage people to go look at the regional tracker.
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone. Yeah, but in general, when we look at things like food processing agriculture, there is that sort of elephant in the room when it comes to rural areas, when it comes to SMMEs, and especially when it comes to food processing, there needs to be a lot more effort in terms of uplifting those parts of the value chain, so that they meet the same standards and the same levels of quality and so forth that we see on the more commercial and retail level. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the domestic market, which also answers some the question that also Kia asked. In the Tech Changes DD, we spoke about social technologies, and I think we need more of that. In KZN, we have the clothing cluster, as well as in the Western Cape, and in Gauteng, we have none of that. So I'd like to call for a more, even though it's not a formalized cluster, but a more social technology or a cluster of sorts, not an unformalized cluster, where clothing and textiles manufacturers, as well as players within the value chain, are able to interact there and share resources and share insights. Because within the value chain, within the value chain, players act in silos. There also was a recent visit by the Ministry of Arts and Culture, where they went to China and spoke to Shein. and without the Ministry of DTIC. So even at a high level, there's also lack of coordination there. So I'd like to call for a more coordinated approach into the value chain. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you to our presenters and our discussant. So we have come to the end of today's session, but we've also come to the end of this 3-part series. And I would like to thank our different researchers who have participated in these development dialogues. I would like to also thank all the people that have participated online as well as in the room. And before I finish my thank yous, Niva, what do you want to say?
I want to say thank you to Rwanda for managing the entire project, not just this process, but making sure everybody had support in doing their papers. They got their papers done and online, and it's been, very much appreciated.
Thank you. All right. So to close shop. So we've got 10 industries that we have covered so far, ranging from, well, I'm going to list all of them: plastics, autos, clothing and textiles, food processing, horticulture, iron and steel, wood and paper, capital equipment, electronics, as well as electrical equipment. And for each of these papers, we have a sort of value chain analysis, which is the overview paper. We've got a paper on international trade, a paper on tech changes, and a paper on sustainability. So I know sometimes it's very intimidating to read a 100-page report. And so what we have done is separate these different topics into different papers, so you can read whichever one you are interested in. We will be updating these regularly. There's already updates, 2-page updates for a few of these industries available already on our TIPS website. Okay. Yeah. So we will be updating these regularly and putting them out on the website as well. But for now, this, as I said, is the end of our series. So thank you to everyone. And that is the end. This fruit at the back. Thank you.